Okay, I think we'll begin the session. Welcome to session Y05, which is entitled The Changing Nuclear World Order, which refers to the changing world order regarding nuclear weapons. My name is Stuart Prager. I'm the moderator for the session, and we have 3 invited speakers lined up. It will be a very interesting session. Each presentation is 30 minutes. Followed by 6 minutes of a question and answer. But then at the end of the 3 talks, as for other sessions, there's an opportunity for an additional 30 minutes of discussion, which all of the attendees are invited to attend, where there could be a further question and answer and further discussion. And to enter that at the end of the 3 presentations, please go to the link on the lower left side of your screen and click on join the networking session. Question and answer, if you want to submit questions, and we encourage you to do so, there's a question and answer space to insert questions on the right side of your screen. And I encourage you to submit the questions during the talks at any time. It's easiest if you do it as it occurs to you, and then they can be accumulated, and then I'll read the questions at the end of each presentation. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Steve Fetter, and this is a special presentation because Steve is the recipient this year of the Leo Szilard Lectureship Award, which is given to people who have made extraordinary contributions in the use of physics for the benefit of society. And Steve fits this description very well. Let me just quickly read the citation that he received to give you an impression of his contributions. It's for seminal contributions to 2 US administrations' efforts to minimize the threat of nuclear war, for helping to establish nuclear archaeology as a viable and effective method for supporting arms control and countering proliferation, and for contributing expert analysis leading to the UN General Assembly's adoption of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. But that's not all he's done. He's written extensively and generated extensive ideas on both the technical and policy aspects of nuclear weapons. He's a professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, and also currently the Dean of the Graduate School. So we're really pleased for Steve to present to receive the award. We're pleased to give it to him and pleased for him to give this lecture. So Steve, turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart. So, well, first let me say that it is a real honor to receive an award named for Leo Szilard, and I'd like to thank the people who nominated me and the selection committee. Szilard, as many of you may know, first conceived of the idea of a fission chain reaction just shortly after the discovery of the neutron. And in fact, patented the idea of a nuclear reactor before there was any discovery of a material that could sustain fission. But immediately after the discovery of fission and uranium, he realized that a nuclear weapon would be possible and drafted a letter that Albert Einstein sent to President Roosevelt, warning that the Germans may be developing such a weapon. And that, of course, led to the Manhattan Project. And Szilard joined the Manhattan Project in Chicago, with Fermi designed and developed the first nuclear reactor. But then as the war was ending, and as it was realized that Germany had not succeeded in developing a nuclear weapon, and he drafted the Frank Report and a petition to call for a warning rather than the actual use of a weapon, and devoted much of the rest of his life to warning about the dangers of nuclear weapons and trying to prevent them. And this is a lectureship award, and quoting from the description, aimed at physicists earlier in their career to promote awareness of the application of physics to social problems and to increase the visibility of those engaged. And this is very apropos because I am engaged in an activity, the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction, as I believe are everyone else on this panel. And a major activity is giving talks at physics departments around the country about the threats posed by nuclear weapons and ways to reduce them. And so I thought I would give a version of the talk that I've given at about a half dozen universities in the last year or so. It will have to be a condensed version of the talk because most physics colloquia are closer to an hour, and this is just a half hour. And also, I expect that most of the people who are joining this session already know how nuclear weapons work and what fissile materials are and have some idea of global and US nuclear arsenals. So I will run very quickly through those topics and focus on nuclear weapon risks, the Obama and Trump records on dealing with those risks, and then proposals for the Biden administration. So I usually begin this talk, because it's a general physics audience, by noting that all nuclear weapons begin with fission, a fast fission chain reaction, and that there are really two materials that can sustain a fast fission chain reaction, high enriched uranium and plutonium. And I talk a bit about how those materials are produced and the fact that limiting the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technologies really is key to limiting the spread of nuclear weapons. And because it's a physics colloquium, I have to have a little bit of physics in there. And so I basically describe the physics of a fast fission chain reaction, and noting that the complete fission of 1 kilogram of uranium or plutonium releases about 15 kilotons of energy, which is the energy that was released by the first nuclear the first nuclear detonations. And then I described the two methods of assembling a supercritical mass, the gun type assembly that was used in the Hiroshima device, and implosion that was used in the Fat Man device. And of course, the implosion is much more efficient, and implosion is the basis of all modern fission weapons. And then I talk about the destruction that one 15 kiloton detonation can result in. And in particular, in Hiroshima, there were about 125,000 deaths. Most of those were immediate from burns and fire and flying debris. Then I talk about modern nuclear weapons, thermonuclear weapons, two-stage weapons, the use of a fission explosive, a modern boosted primary with a yield of a few kilotons, the use of the radiation from that weapon to implode a secondary that contains fusion fuel, as well as fissionable material, and that can produce yields of megatons or tens of megatons. And I then note that the destruction that would be caused by the average sized current nuclear weapon, sort of the average yield of a weapon in the US or Russian arsenal, is currently about 350 kilotons, about 20 times that of Hiroshima. And the area of destruction is about 10 times larger. And if such a weapon were detonated above Washington, it would result in about 1 million deaths from blast and fire. And so it is amazing to think, with that magnitude of destruction, that the US at one time deployed 30,000 such nuclear weapons, and Russia deployed over 40,000 nuclear weapons. There was a great decrease in the US and Russian arsenals after the end of the Cold War and the signing of the INF and START treaties. But still, you can see that global arsenals are quite large, a total of 10,000 nuclear weapons in the world, and the US and Russia account for 90% of those arsenals. And again, just any one weapon sufficient to destroy a great city. And then I go into more detail on the US nuclear stockpile, talk about the difference between strategic warheads, which are deployed on a triad of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, and bombers, and that the US deploys about 1,600 strategic weapons, of which 900 are always kept on alert in a posture in which they can be launched within minutes of an order. And there are also a small number of deployed non-strategic warheads on fighter aircraft in Europe, or actually in storage to be loaded onto fighter aircraft. And then a fairly substantial, over 2,000 reserve warheads, so that the US has the capacity to increase the number of deployed warheads quickly if that should become necessary. And here are the photos of the triad, the ICBMs, the Minuteman ICBMs, the Trident submarines, the B-52 bomber, and the B-2 bomber. And note that all of this is to be replaced starting in about 10 years at a total cost of $1.2 trillion. Now, $1 trillion used to sound like more before we regularly had appropriations bills for that amount. And here's a breakdown of the cost, about $400 billion in hardware and over $800 billion over this period in operation and sustainment. Now, of course, I'm going through this very quickly. I would go through this more slowly in actual talk. So, but now let me slow down so that I can focus on nuclear weapon risks. Why do we worry about these weapons? And what has been done and what could be done to reduce those risks. All countries with nuclear weapons say that they have them to deter nuclear attack. They have them so that no country will attack with nuclear weapons. But it's important to realize that miscalculations and mistakes are possible. And perhaps the most worrisome miscalculation is escalation. That countries armed with nuclear weapons get into a war and the war escalates, perhaps because one party is losing and their reputation is at stake, or maybe vital interests are seen to be at stake and they don't want to back down. And in a desperate bid to prevent defeat, they escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. And this is imaginable in a number of contexts between the US and Russia. Ukraine was, of course, is not a member of NATO, but if it were, the Russian invasion of Ukraine could easily have escalated. And there are many who worry that this is possible, say, perhaps with a Baltic state. A conflict between US and China is easily imaginable, particularly over Taiwan. Perhaps if Taiwan moved to assert its independence from China and China intervened with military force to prevent that. And perhaps we use forces that are based in Japan in the defense of Taiwan. You can easily see how escalation might result. North Korean attacks against South Korea or Japan might involve nuclear weapons or lead to the use of nuclear weapons. Any war between India and Pakistan, and there have been several wars in the past, and now that both countries are armed with nuclear weapons, and particularly in their different conceptions of nuclear weapons, it's easy to see how a war could escalate to nuclear use. And then any conflict that involved Israel and threatened the survival of Israel. So that's escalation, but accidents are also possible. In the early days of the US nuclear arsenal, there were many accidents involving nuclear weapons. None led to a nuclear detonation. Several led to the dispersal of plutonium. And in those days, not all weapons were 1 point safe. And it is possible that an accident could have led to a detonation. There have also been many false warnings of nuclear attack, both in Russia and in the United States. Fortunately, in every case, it was determined that those warnings were false before any retaliation was ordered. And then one should also worry about the possibility that a military officer might use nuclear weapons, might be physically able to use nuclear weapons without an order from the political authority. That was possible in the United States before we equipped nuclear weapons with permissive action links, PALs. That may be a concern in other nuclear countries today. Nuclear terrorism using stolen materials is another concern. There are 21 known intercepts of high-enriched uranium or plutonium, and there are probably more of which we're unaware. Although terrorists can't produce plutonium or high-enriched uranium, they probably could make a nuclear weapon, especially with HEU, using gun-type assembly, if they came into possession of sufficient nuclear material. And then finally, even if none of these terrible things happen, even if there's never a nuclear detonation, there has been and could be in the future nuclear arms races that result in unnecessary expenditures, hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. So President Obama, when he was Senator Obama, he was very focused on these nuclear risks. And in fact, one of his first major speeches as president was on this issue. It was in Prague, just 75 days into his presidency. And the signature line that everyone remembers is that one in bold below: to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. And he outlined an agenda that had 4 pillars that became known as the Prague Agenda. The first pillar was to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy and urge others to do the same. And he promised to negotiate a new treaty, arms control treaty with Russia, and to seek further cuts that would include all nuclear weapon states. The second pillar was, as long as these weapons exist, to maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal to deter any adversary. The third pillar was to strengthen the Non-Proliferation Treaty and to bring North Korea and Iran back into compliance. And the fourth pillar was to ensure that terrorists never acquire a nuclear weapon. And much was accomplished during the 8 years of the Obama administration. Very quickly, the New START Treaty was negotiated and signed and ratified by the US Senate, and that resulted in a 1/3 reduction in deployed strategic warheads. With regard to reducing the role of nuclear weapons in our policy, the US stated for the first time that it would not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states that were in compliance with their non-proliferation obligations. There was a pledge not to build any new types of nuclear weapons. And then there was a determination that an additional 1/3 reduction in strategic weapons could be achieved, and an offer to negotiate an additional treaty with Russia and to include all nuclear weapons, including tactical nuclear weapons, in those reductions. With regard to nuclear terrorism, there were 4 nuclear security summits to persuade countries to reduce or eliminate their stockpiles of nuclear, of HEU and plutonium, and to secure the remaining stockpiles. That resulted in the removal of 4 tons of HEU, including all of the HEU from 33 countries. That was definitely a big contribution to our security. And then what I thought at the time was the crowning achievement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA with Iran. Now, that was the good. Unfortunately, to secure Senate ratification of the New START Treaty required a pledge to modernize all 3 legs of the triad and not to limit ballistic missile defenses. In the area of nuclear policy, there was a decision to retain tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. And although there was consideration of a sole purpose or no first use pledge, that was ultimately rejected. And there was the continuation of counterforce targeting, which requires large arsenals. There was a failure to begin follow-on negotiations with Russia, largely because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, failure to make progress on ratification of the comprehensive test ban or the negotiation of a fissile material cutoff treaty. And of course, after the invasion of Ukraine, cooperation with Russia ended, and there was no progress on North Korea. So I did the good, the bad. I couldn't resist calling the record of the Trump administration the ugly, because it really went in the opposite direction of the Obama initiatives, beginning with new low-yield weapons to expand the range of credible options in response to a possible Russian attack. The deliberate erosion of security guarantees to allies. President Trump even at one point suggested that Japan and South Korea should develop their own nuclear weapons rather than rely on the United States for its security. Expanded national and regional ballistic missile defenses, which prompted Russia and China to increase and modernize their offensive forces. Opening negotiations with North Korea was good, but no agreement resulted from those negotiations. And then, of course, withdrawal from the INF Treaty and the JCPOA, the Iran Agreement, which, of course, President Biden is now trying to restore. And a refusal to extend the New START Treaty unless there were concessions from Russia, and even a suggestion that arms races are good and can be won. So how can the Biden administration reduce nuclear risks? Well, first, extend New START to 2026. That happened. That happened before it expired in early February, so I have a check mark next to that. But the other elements would be to pursue deeper reductions with Russia and also with all nuclear weapon states, to eliminate launch on warning and to reduce or eliminate silo-based ICBMs, adopt a policy of sole purpose or no first use, and then finally to limit ballistic missile defense. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about missile defense in the next talk. So let me just do a couple minutes on each of these. So we have lived through 50 years of US-Russia nuclear arms control. You see, beginning in 1969, there has always been a treaty either under negotiation or in force. And New START will expire now in 2026, and we need to begin the process of a new agreement that will extend limitations. New START limits only deployed accountable strategic warheads. And even when I say accountable, that means bombers only count as one, even they can be armed with a dozen or more bombs. There are no limits on reserve strategic warheads. And as you saw, we have 2,000 of those that could quickly be uploaded, and no limits on non-strategic warheads. And Russia has thousands of those. And of course, there's no limits on China or the UK or France. They're not covered by any of these agreements. So we should work towards an agreement that would limit all 5 of these arsenals, starting with Russia. Limit deployed strategic warheads to 1,000. That is what the Obama administration already determined was a quite feasible and desirable target. And then to limit the total number of warheads, including the non-deployed and non-strategic warheads. And I would suggest a limit of about 2,000, about twice the number of deployed strategic. And then it will be difficult, but, and probably initially just a commitment by China, UK, and France not to increase the total number of warheads beyond their current level, maybe as much as we can expect. Now, achieving this sort of agreement will probably require understandings on other issues that are related to nuclear forces, like missile defense, like precision conventional strike. And so this will not be easy. And what that first slide I showed you, those were all treaties. You'll note I said an agreement, not a treaty. And that is because the founding fathers made treaties very difficult. They wanted to avoid foreign entanglements, and so they required that all treaties required the advice and consent of the Senate, ratified by 2/3 of the senators. That 67 votes. That would mean in the current Senate getting 17 Republicans to join. And even New START only had 13 Republicans join it, and it was completely uncontroversial. And as you saw, the administration paid a high price for ratification and having to agree to modernization and to no limits on missile defense. And Russia really, frankly, is uninterested in further reductions without some limits on US missile defense, but no treaty could be ratified that had any limits, even informal limits. So we need to consider alternatives to treaties. Beginning with strategic stability talks, and you may have heard that in the recent phone call between President Biden and President Putin, they agreed to begin there. But then that will need to be followed with some sort of agreement that would not require ratification. And it might be something like the JCPOA, a political commitment, or it could simply be reciprocal unilateral measures. Second policy that I think would be desirable to eliminate launch on warning and to reduce or eliminate silo-based ICBMs. So deterrence depends on both sides that have forces that can survive any attack and deliver devastating retaliation, because if an attacker knows they can't prevent their own destruction, they won't attack in the first place. The problem is that ICBMs, which were originally survivable, they're in hardened concrete silos, and when they were built, they could survive a nuclear attack, but missiles are now so accurate they can't survive. And because they can't survive, both the US and Russia keep these missiles constantly on alert, with the option to be launched on warning of an attack before they can be destroyed. And this forces a president to make a very quick decision in just a few minutes on whether to launch on warning. It also raises the possibility of a launch on false warning. So I think stability would be improved, and tens of, maybe $100 billion saved by phasing out silo-based ICBMs. Adopt a policy of sole purpose or no first use. This was considered during the Obama administration, and the result was a sort of statement that the time is not quite right, but we'll work toward it. These are very closely related. Sole purpose would say the sole purpose of US nuclear weapons is to deter a nuclear attack, or if necessary, respond against a nuclear attack against the United States or its allies. And no first use would be a pledge not to use nuclear weapons unless the US or its allies have been first attacked with nuclear weapons. And President Biden, when he was vice president and during the campaign, made statements in favor of both of these. And so I am optimistic that, in fact, this will be adopted perhaps soon. And I do want to point out that opposition to sole purpose and no first use is really incompatible with our commitment to non-proliferation. We are the most powerful military force on the planet. We spend 4 times more than China, 10 times more than Russia, 80 times more than North Korea on defense. The US and its allies account for 70% of world military spending. So if we need nuclear weapons to deter a non-nuclear attack, then weaker nations would have even more need for nuclear weapons. So my final point is on missile defense. And so missile defense was originally intended to defeat Soviet missiles, but we soon realized that this was impossible because the Soviet Union could defeat the system at lower cost than either by building more missiles or deploying countermeasures. And no offensive limitations were possible so long as missile defenses were a prospect, because both sides wanted to have the option of building up the offense to overwhelm the defense. That realization led to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which limited ballistic missile defenses and allowed the first agreement, the first arms control agreement on offensive limitations. So today the focus is on defending against North Korea and Iran to some extent, but we're stuck in the same paradox that ballistic missile defense can be both ineffective and counterproductive. And I don't have time to talk about all of the countermeasures, but the basic point is that these are defensive systems that work in midcourse, the midcourse of a missile in space, And in the vacuum of space, there are lots of ways to make things look like a nuclear warhead or to make a nuclear warhead look like something else. And so these defenses are ineffective, but also counterproductive because they prompt Russia and China to increase their offensive forces and in reliance on launch on warning. And we can see that in a speech that President Putin gave about 3 years ago, where he described a whole suite of new nuclear weapon systems that Russia was developing. And the common thread behind all of these new systems, a heavy ICBM that can carry up to 24 warheads or attack from around the South Pole, a hypersonic glide vehicle, intercontinental nuclear-powered cruise missiles and torpedoes. The common element is they only make sense if you're worried about missile defense. And so the question,
See 1 minute, please.
Oh, thanks. That's perfect because I just have this last slide. Is can we effectively address the Iranian and North Korean missile threats without triggering those reactions by Russia and China? And for Iran, I think we clearly can, because Iran has said it is not interested. It has no interest in building or deploying or testing missiles with a range more than 2,000 kilometers. And so a ban on testing at that range or other related capabilities should be possible to both negotiate and verify. North Korea is a lot trickier because North Korea has already tested what is effectively an ICBM. And so one idea that I'm working on with a co-author is the possibility of boost phase defense from airborne platforms. But perhaps we could also have verifiable limits on the number and capability of interceptors to reassure Russia and China that it has no capability. And then I talk about joining the coalition, but in that talk, but I will just stop my presentation at this point and take questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. Great talk. We have one question from Robert Wimmer, and he says, I'll read, great talk. Thank you. How big do you see the risk today that non-state actors, terrorists, rebel forces like in East Ukraine, et cetera, can get access to a nuclear weapon or material from a state like North Korea, et cetera?
Well, I worry particularly about access to the material because in the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, we know that there were lapses in security at nuclear facilities where high enriched uranium was stored. And we know it's very easy to make a nuclear device with high enriched uranium. It is not that difficult. And we know from these 21 smuggling cases in which HEU has been interdicted, we know that it's out there. So I think this really is a serious concern. I worry a little less about a stolen nuclear weapon, except perhaps, in some cases, perhaps in some countries like Pakistan, there may be anti-government groups that are monitoring shipments of nuclear weapons. But what I hope is that there is sufficient security, and usually much, much better security around nuclear weapons than there is around nuclear materials, although I think high-enriched uranium should receive the same level of physical protection and security as nuclear weapon.
So Steve, we have about 2 or 3 more questions. We'll have to do quick questions and quick answers, even though these are big questions. There's a question from Kostas Kravaris. Great talk. Is there a reliable way to verify that warheads that are disarmed are indeed disarmed and discarded?
So yeah, this is, of course, all the design details of nuclear weapons are secrets for a country, so you don't want to reveal any of those. So probably what you want to do is verify that a certain amount of nuclear material has been recovered and put in storage. And so you could watch a nuclear weapon go into a facility where it will be dismantled, and then you could watch and see that a certain amount of plutonium and high enriched uranium come out. That is probably the easiest and simplest way to confirm that nuclear weapons have been dismantled.
Another question from Anonymous. Terrific talk. What will be the reaction in Japan to a no first use announcement by the US?
So this has been one of the reasons that previous administrations have not adopted a sole purpose or no first use, because of concerns by Japan. But this would not affect the US security guarantee for Japan, that we still would reserve the right, and we would deter any nuclear attack on Japan by reserving the right to respond to that nuclear attack with nuclear weapons. So it really should not have any impact on the security of Japan. And I think we need to make that clear to Japan. I have been visiting Japan and talking about this issue for many years. And one question I always ask is to please describe, if you're opposed to no first use, to please describe the scenario in which Japan would wish the United States to use nuclear weapons first on behalf of Japan. And so far, I have not received any answer to that. And so my basic point is that threats that you would never carry out are not credible. And if they're not credible, they don't function as a deterrent.
Okay, there is another comment, but I think we'll hold it for the discussion session at the end of the 3 presentations, so to keep on schedule. Thanks tremendously, Steve, for the talk, and we'll be back in contact with you later.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Fred Lamb. Fred is a professor of theoretical astrophysics emeritus and research professor at the University of Illinois. He's also a faculty member in the program on arms control, disarmament, and international security. So, well, in addition to his vast contributions to astrophysics, which is not the topic of the moment for this session, Fred has made decades of contributions to various aspects of arms control, technically through serving on key committees and other ways. He currently is the chair of an APS study on ballistic missile defense, an area in which Fred is an expert, and is the topic of his talk right now, which is entitled Nuclear Weapons and Missile Defense. So Fred, if you would share your screen.
So it seems we're still having trouble with the video link, so I will appear only as a photograph as far as I can tell. So let me now share my screen.
Thank you, Fred.
Can you see that okay?
Yes, very good.
Great. So I want to tell you how delighted I am to be able to talk to you today about nuclear weapons and missile defense. And the wonderful talk that Steve just gave provides a great introduction for what I want to talk about this afternoon. So let me begin by also pointing out, as he did, the enormous destructive power of even a single nuclear weapon. As he noted, even a nuclear weapon of 200 kilotons on a major city could kill 1 million people and seriously injure millions more. So this presents an enormous challenge for any missile defense. In the past, you could have an anti-bomber systems and destroy 10% or so. And before the bombers could actually destroy a country or a city, usually you could actually make it impossible. But here you have to protect a country by essentially working perfectly to prevent a nuclear weapon from exploding. And that's a very demanding thing. It started out with a great imbalance between nuclear weapons and defenses against them. And as I'll discuss, there's been a cycle in which there have been continuing efforts to create defenses which have spurred, even though they were ineffective, growth in nuclear arsenals. But the balance has never shifted. And so I'll describe some of the current situations. But let me first begin with a little bit of history. I will just note, as has already been explained, that there's an enormous arsenal that both Russia and the US have, and much, much smaller, but still significant arsenals of the 7 other countries that have nuclear weapons. So this is something that one has to confront. Let me just mention some of the history of the US ICBM intercept efforts. really, for 60 years and a little more, there has been a hope that somehow a defense that was effective against nuclear weapons could be developed and deployed. It would make us feel safer if it were possible. For some people, they really bristle at being deterred, and having a completely effective defense would eliminate the deterrence. But that hasn't happened. In the 1950s and 60s, efforts were made using what's called a terminal defense, and I'll describe that in a little bit more detail, but basically to try to intercept warheads when they were very near the target as they re-entered the atmosphere. And because the accuracy was so poor, these weapons, even till the mid-70s, these missiles were armed with very large megaton class nuclear weapons to try to destroy the warhead without coming very close to it. And that continued until the Star Wars program, which had all kinds of very advanced technologies that were talked about, and money was spent on it, maybe $60 billion, but didn't actually turn into anything that was useful, though it did stand in the way of arms control agreements at the time. Then more recently, there's been a focus on what's called midcourse intercept, as Steve described, in warheads passing through space. And the first attempt was the protection against accidental launch, the GPALs, which was basically designed to maybe defeat an accidentally or a rogue officer launch of one missile using this kind of technology. But then toward the end of the 1990s, that it became politically difficult to resist, and this National Missile Defense Research Program began. But then in the George W. Bush years, it was actually deployed before, as I'll describe, before anything much had been tested. So most of these systems were actually never deployed or activated, and none of them were really shown to be effective in real-world battle situations. So what about the current approaches? Well, there's an enormous number. And let me just remind us that there are three main phases in the flight of a long-range ballistic missile. The boost phase of powered flight, which may be less than 3 minutes for a solid propellant missile, maybe up to 4 or 5 minutes even for a long burn liquid propellant missile. And then there's the midcourse phase, which lasts maybe 20 minutes, when the warheads and the debris and the rocket bodies are basically following ballistic trajectories through the near vacuum of near Earth space. And then the last tens of seconds when these objects re-enter the Earth's atmosphere is called the terminal phase. So the programs that are being pursued to one degree or another at the moment are an enormous number of very different approaches. There's the theater high altitude area defense, which is basically an attempt to intercept warheads very close to the target. And so they can only defend small areas this way, but for high value targets, it's discussed as a way to go. There's the ground-based midcourse defense that Steve talked about. But there's so many problems with that I'll come to, that there's been talk and work on a whole host of other approaches. The Aegis at sea missiles for midcourse defense, Aegis missiles ashore for midcourse, drone-based rockets for boost phase intercept, drones with lasers, fighter aircraft with rockets, all these for boost phase, fighter aircraft with lasers, space-based rockets, and space-based lasers. So there's an enormous number of things that are being pursued to one degree or another. And I think there's a message here. If we really knew how to do this, we could focus on one or maybe two approaches that we could focus on and make sure it worked. But when you have a program which is so unfocused and is following so many diverse and different approaches, I think that's a clue that we really don't know how to solve this problem. So let me talk for a minute about the challenges faced by any midcourse intercept system. The fundamental challenge faced by midcourse intercept systems Steve talked about. How do you discriminate nuclear warheads from non-threatening objects? It's hard. because all objects in space, regardless of their size and mass, follow similar ballistic trajectories. As a result, it's very hard for a defensive system to distinguish warheads from incidental objects like spent upper stages, fragments of stages or missile insulation, debris, all kinds of things, bolts, things that accompany on their orbital trajectory the actual warhead. And then there's all these different kinds of various decoys that can be also made to accompany the warheads, and you can create anti-simulation devices that encase the real warheads and make them appear to be just like the decoys. So this problem has not yet been even seriously addressed, let alone solved. And there have been a series of reports. The most recent one was the National Academy study in 2012, which said, basically, you shouldn't spend any more money on this until you solve this problem, because ultimately, this is what you're going to run into. And if you can't solve this, this won't work. But the persistence has been to go ahead and do something. So the system has been built. It was built before it was tested, as I'll explain. But even before we get to the problem of discrimination, there are more basic problems that are unsolved. These systems are very complex. They've got to function under fierce time pressures and stressing conditions, and they have to work essentially perfectly on a moment's notice. And they're very time-consuming and expensive to test. So it's not surprising that very serious engineering and quality assurance problems continued to surface. They were very bad in the beginning, and they continued to be found. Part of it was that this system was deployed before it was ever into the full prototype stage. And also, the individual vehicles, especially the kill vehicles, very complicated, but they're put together by hand, and they're almost unique articles. So even if you find what's wrong with one of them and fix that, it does not mean that you fix the problems in the other ones. So let me focus on the particular midcourse defense called the ground-based midcourse. This is the only operational, supposedly, system that we currently have. And I've shown a list of the current elements, the 40 interceptors at Fort Greely, 4 at Vandenberg. There's a variety of sensors, the Defense Support Program early warning satellites, the more sophisticated space-based infrared satellites, and a suite of very high-resolution radars, and then the command and control system. But I re-emphasize, this program and this whole approach was judged to be still in the research phase in 2000. But G.W. Bush, President Bush, withdrew from the ABM treaty and ordered deployment before testing, really for political reasons. And as an example, 24 interceptors were deployed in 2004 before a single intercept test of their design. And so, not surprisingly, it's been remarked by delay after delay, repeated failures, and attempts to find some way to fix this system at enormous cost. So what are some of the difficulties in tests? I think the actual defense agency responsible for assessing the system and the Government Accountability Office has said that despite 20 years of tests, the ground-based missile defense test program has provided only very limited information about how the system would perform under real-world battle conditions. The first 10 tests used only prototype interceptors, and only 5 destroyed the target. In the next 9 tests, only, again, 5 destroyed the target, so about half. It did not improve. 18 of the 19 tests that have been performed to date were developmental. Only the most recent test performed in March 2019 was considered operational. And all of these tests have been carefully scripted, strictly controlled under unrealistic conditions, with a launch time of the target missile and target illumination by the sun carefully chosen. Only the last two were even against ICBM range missiles. And as I said, none used unannounced target launches, none used challenging countermeasures, none used more than a single target missile. When you might well expect a country like North Korea, if they were able to launch missiles, would want to launch, and they practice for other missiles salvo launches all the time. Other important strategic systems are tested regularly. For example, the Trident II submarine-launched ballistic missile is tested about 6 times per year on average, and it's been tested 167 times since its design was completed in 1989. But it's so expensive to test the GMD system. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars every test, and it's taken them 6 months or a year or more to actually analyze the results from a single test. So there have been efforts to try and find some way to fix the system. And here's a few of them. One way is to fire multiple interceptors against every target warhead. So for example, if you had 5 incoming warheads and the interceptor success against one warhead is 50%, which seems about right for the very carefully choreographed case. It's possibly quite small for a realistic battlefield case. And if the failures are uncorrelated, which is usually not the case, if interceptor fails against one target, the same problem may well infect other interceptors. But making these assumptions, if you had 5 incoming warheads and you fired 5 interceptors, the chance that one would survive is 97%. And this is a list. If you fire 10 interceptors, if you fire 20 interceptors, suppose you fire 30 interceptors, still the chance that one warhead survives is almost 30%. It's an intolerable risk, unacceptable. That's the current policy, to try and fix it by doing this. Another option would be to fix the kill vehicle. Well, 7 major efforts have been made to try to do this. The latest was to produce a completely new, redesigned kill vehicle. And over a period of a couple of years, 3 years, $1.2 billion was spent. It was a complete failure, and it was totally canceled in 2019. And the conclusion was that they're now going to try to restart such a program, but it cannot possibly deliver a new kill vehicle for about 10 years. So that means we are stuck with a system which costs near $60 billion, and we're very confident doesn't really work. The National Academy study in 2012 said, look, this whole thing is misbegotten from the beginning. What you need to do is start over. Design a completely new interceptor rocket, boosters, use a new kill vehicle that can support a shoot, look, shoot strategy, which means that you have to have the kill vehicle be able to communicate with the offboard sensors so that you can tell whether the warhead's been killed and redirect it, the succeeding interceptors, and have it communicate. That's not possible today. And they said, if you do this and also add an interceptor base in the eastern US and 5 additional X-band radars, then you might be able to make some progress in solving this problem. Essentially, none of these things have been done. It would be very expensive. And in some cases, we don't know exactly how to do it, but that's what they said would be required. So what has been another thing that's been suggested and is being tried is to add underlayers. So you have the GMD addressing the warheads in the midcourse phase, in the middle of the midcourse phase. So the plan is to use dozens of Aegis ships with the SM-3 interceptors as sea-based midcourse interceptors to try to intercept the warheads that were missed by the ground-based system. And then to follow up with using THAAD batteries around high-value targets to try to intercept warheads that were missed by both the GMD and the Aegis systems as these warheads close on the target. Well, it's kind of like throwing everything you can think of at the problem, but it's not really solving the problem. So this is a picture of what we're talking about. It's a cartoon, of course, and it's substantial effort's gone into making it look good. But here's the warhead coming in here. The idea is that you'd have ground-based missiles fire, and there would be a first attempt to intercept, maybe a second attempt, especially if you have a shoot, look, or shoot assess capability, which we do not have. And there's no effort to create it at present. And then you'd have these Aegis SM-3 missiles launched from an Aegis ship and try to intercept late in midcourse. And then finally, as the RV approaches the target, try to knock it down with the THAAD system. The 2019 Missile Defense Review advocated a completely unbounded missile defense program. It advocated all these different systems that I talked about before, and it recommended basically using all available Aegis cruisers for this goal. So there was a test now of the Aegis system against an ICBM RV, the first ever, and that was in November 2020. And of course, it was carefully scripted for success. It's not given then that it would succeed, but was reported as successful. The 2020 CBO report estimated that 100 Aegis ships could be available to be devoted to this by 2029. But this is a huge expansion of the US missile defense program. It's not clear that it would really address the problem, even for North Korea. But you start deploying these kinds of assets, then military forces, officers in Russia and particularly China, but in Russia, they begin to worry a lot about what's going to happen here. So this is part of the cycle of building defense and creating more offense. So because of all the problems with the midcourse defense, people have turned to boost phase intercept. And here's the appeal. It could, in principle, prevent warheads from reaching their targets. It could, in principle, defend a very large area because you're knocking down the booster as it lifts. And it's often been portrayed as easier than intercepting warheads during midcourse or terminal flight. But as I'll tell you, it's not quite true. Boost phase intercept has some very serious challenges. People say, well, North Korea, you just attack the launch site and it can't be that hard. North Korea is a small country. That's a complete misunderstanding. By the time an interceptor could reach an ICBM, the ICBM would be at least 500 kilometers or more from its launch site. And for ICBMs launched from North Korea against the United States, they fly north over China and Russia. So that's where you're going to be intercepting, not over North Korea. And nonetheless, the intercept has to occur very quickly. Less than 170 seconds, if it's a solid propellant missile, could be even 120 seconds, or 280 seconds if liquid propellant, but it could easily be 240. It makes a big difference. And when intercepted, the ICBMs are moving fast at 5 or even 6 kilometers a second. The exhaust plume is bright, so people say, well, you can really see it well. But you know what? Hitting the exhaust plume accomplishes nothing. And what you have to do is hit the cold body of the missile, or better yet, the warhead. And that's a very difficult problem. And it's made more difficult because this is not an object on a ballistic trajectory. ICBMs in powered flight move unpredictably, even if they're not trying to take evasive maneuvers, and they can evade, and they're very hard to hit as a consequence. And there are many other effective countermeasures to boost phase that usually are not mentioned. Let me talk about two particular systems that have attracted a lot of attention in the last few years, and as part of the Missile Defense Review, talked about having lasers or rocket interceptors on fighter aircraft. People mentioned the F-16 or the F-35, in particular the F-35. But it has to be very, very close to the ICBM launch site to be able to do this. And the military has said this is only possible if the United States completely controls North Korean airspace. So what you're talking about is after the war is won, then you can try and suppress any additional launches. But this is not what one normally thinks of as defending the US. Another possibility is lasers or rocket interceptors on drones. And the idea would be to have drones loiter on station for tens of hours or even days, so they would have to stay at least 100 kilometers or maybe up to 300 kilometers away from the North Korean coast in the case of North Korea. So laser weapons that they're talking about using do not exist, and it's very difficult to conceive for the foreseeable future that that's possible. So let me talk a little bit more about rocket interceptors. So this has received a lot of attention because it has a lot of attractive features, and it's not completely unreasonable. It's motivated by the desire to defend against North Korean ICBMs while avoiding the discrimination problem faced by midcourse systems, and at the same time, not threatening Russian or Chinese ICBMs. Existing proposals to develop and deploy such a system quickly and cheaply have advocated using already available, previously qualified parts. But neither the boosters that have been talked about nor the kill vehicles that have been proposed so far are actually workable for this mission. So we would need different hardware from what's been proposed so far. But a 5 kilometer per second interceptor is possible to be carried on these drones, and it could theoretically defend the US if the US were attacked by liquid propellant ICBMs with long burn times. And by the way, the Hwasong 15 ICBM has the long burn time of 290 seconds. But with the pressure of such a defense, there's a possibility that North Korea could acquire ICBMs with more typical burn times of the 1970s, not the 1960s. And those would have burn times of 240 seconds or less. And then the architectures that are currently being discussed would not succeed. If the attack used solid propellant ICBMs, they have much shorter burn times. And this approach is really unworkable. So it also has, putting out there drones armed in this way has potential arms control and arms race implications as well.
Fred, 4-minute warning.
Okay, so the US missile defense program appears also to have stimulated Russia and China to deploy new weapons, as Steve talked about. I mentioned here the hypersonic boost glide vehicle, the Sarmat large ICBM capable of carrying many warheads and many penetration aids. China is also deploying new ICBMs and submarine launch missiles with characteristics that look like they were designed to help counter the possibility that the US might have a defense. And it has not dissuaded North Korea. If we look here at North Korean missile and nuclear tests, we deployed the ground-based missile defense system here. And people say, well, that's dissuaded North Korea. It certainly doesn't look like it. I don't think that's the case at all. And this is just to remind you of the North Korean sequence of missile tests in 2017, which showed that they had an ICBM that was capable of reaching the United States. And then more recently in October, they showed a model of what would be, if it were ever built, a super heavy ICBM. And why would you build something like this? You can already reach the United States. Well, you could carry multiple warheads, penetration aids, and things like that. So it looks like if it has any purpose at all, it's again driven by the desire to counter the US missile defense. So how can we reduce the nuclear threat to the United States? Building a missile defense sounds like it's the right thing to do, but history and experience of the last 5 decades have shown that it only makes us less safe. And why is that? Basically, nuclear weapons forever change the calculus of attack versus defense. The offense started out far ahead, both technologically and cost-wise. Huge investments were made in defense. The US has spent more than $350 billion on on missile defense to date. But the technological developments have never changed this enormous imbalance, and there's no prospect of it happening in the foreseeable future. It turns out that spending on missile defense has only made us less safe by causing our potential adversaries to increase their nuclear arsenals. So if anything went wrong and they actually were used, we'd be harmed much more. We have only become more safe when we've made agreements that reduced the number of nuclear weapons that threaten us. And this has only been possible when we agreed to limit defenses. Thanks a lot for letting me talk to you about this, and I'd be delighted to answer questions.
Thank you, Fred. That was terrific. I learned a lot from that talk. We have one came in during your talk from Cheryl Spencer, a question of clarification on the Trident submarine missile tests. Is it that they have defense missiles, or are they firing test missiles for the GMD to try to stop?
For the Trident, those are tests of offensive, the D5 missiles, and they're testing them by launching them from Trident submarines to make sure they work okay. In the case of the ground-based missile defense, those are special target missiles that are launched from the Pacific toward the US. And as I mentioned, almost all of them were actually not ICBMs, but they do test Minuteman missiles by launching them. And some missiles of that type will probably be used as targets in the future. I don't know if I answered your question. I hope so.
I think so.
That's a great question.
There are other questions at the, oh, here's a question. There's a question from Joel Premack. What has been the progress in the new APS study that you're leading?
Well, we're making great progress. We're working on a draft report. As you may know, we're going to try and have the report finished and released this summer. And this gives me an opportunity. I meant to say at the beginning, everything I said here is my own personal view and does not reflect that study. And I'm not saying that this is what the study will say by any means.
Here's a question from an anonymous questioner. Is it feasible that the US may have missile defense systems not known by the public? From your talk, it would certainly be in the best interest for adversarial nations to not know our full defense capabilities.
I think that the chance of that is absolutely zero. It's, to create any kind of defense like this, it's a huge industrial scale project. And of course, you wouldn't believe it if it hadn't been tested, and you can see the tests very readily. So I don't think that's really a factor.
Okay, thank you, Fred. I think we'll draw this question and answer session to a close, come back to it later, and move on to the next talk, which is given by Sebastien Philippe. Sebastien is a research scholar at the Program on Science and Global Security at Princeton University. Sebastien has contributed to verification science, nuclear archaeology science. He recently completed a major report with colleagues and even published a book on the effects of weapons testing in the South Pacific, testing by the French government. But his talk today is on the emerging technology arms race, nuclear weapons and global security. So Sebastien, you there?
I am here. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Stuart, for the kind introduction. And let me share my screen now. So today, as Stuart mentioned, I'm going to talk about the emerging technology arms race, nuclear weapons and global security, which was, I hope, nicely fit into the session today. This is a project that we started at Princeton in the Program on Science and Global Security about a year ago. So what I will present today is, to some extent, work in progress. But we hope to make important contributions in this field over the coming 2 years. So what is the context here? Is, as you may know, we are experiencing a new era of great power competitions. So we're set, especially between the US, Russia, and China, where technology is playing a fundamental role in that competition. President Biden, about a month ago, was giving his first press conference, and during that press conference, said the following thing, which I found extremely interesting. He said, the future lies in who can, in fact, own the future as it relates to technology. And President Biden here was making the point that the US was going to invest massively in industries of the future, in particular artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotech. And the point was to make real investments, I believe around 2% of the US GDP, that China was already out investing the US by a long shot because they were planning to own our future, essentially. So the technology here and the development of so-called emerging technologies is playing a central and fundamental role in the current renewed competition and hopefully not, but possible confrontation between great power over the coming decades. And in the background of that competition, this renewed competition and confrontation is are essentially the nuclear weapon arsenals that have been left over from the Cold War, and that for the past 20, 30 years, we've continued to maintain at much lower levels than during the height of the Cold War, but still at levels important enough that we have the capability to pretty much destroy our current civilization. So one question that is important here is, as we're seeing this new massive investment in technology and pursuit of technological supremacy, if you will, what will be the influence of such movement on existing nuclear arsenal? And this is a particularly important question because all current nuclear arsenals are under modernization in every country. And so here I'm picking one example because I'm a French citizen, so I'm allowed also to I guess criticize my own government. But here we have a few weeks ago the French Minister of Defense, Florence Parly, who gave a talk, and we're in the middle of the COVID crisis. She has her mask on, and deciding to build a new fleet of submarine of SSBN, so the large submarines that carries ballistic missiles. And she was saying that this new generation that will come online in the 2030s, that has been developed for the past 10 years or so already, will be fielded until 2090, so 2090. And so this is the conundrum here for people doing force planning, I would say, within the Department of Defense, is to think about how they're going to field those nuclear weapon systems pretty much over the entire century amid this environment of new and emerging technologies. So here I just want to put things in context, and the only way I could do that was to look at what had happened in the 20th century. So we're in 2021. So if you take exactly 100 years ago, Albert Einstein was awarded the Physics Nobel Prize for his services to theoretical physics, and especially for his discovery of the photoelectric effect. It's also the year 1921 where the Communist Party of China was founded. And 1990, which is 70 years, to match the strategic planning for a period of 70 years. In 1990, we had Berners-Lee here, who was accessing the first web page in the first web browser using the first, using on the first web servers in the first web browsers on Christmas Day 1990. It was also at the time where we were seeing the collapse of socialist government in Eastern Europe and the prelude to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in this time span of 70 years, obviously in the 20th century, we had major technological discoveries and geopolitical events that most likely were impossible to foresee in 1921. Yet, we're experiencing a new long-term modernization of nuclear arsenals, who pretty much assumes that things will look the same as they look today. No. So how, essentially, how is this going to play with the possibility of new risk emerging from the militarization of new technologies? So new technologies do bring new risk that were not here before. They also bring new risks to existing systems. One key issue that we see, and that was very clear in the previous presentation on missile defense, is the way we perceive risk in military affairs. If a country is massively investing in key technologies and overpromising that that technology will have profound revolutionary effects in the context of warfare, then other adversaries are going to assume worst case scenarios and either start developing their own systems or increase their military spending and so on. And so we get into this situation where offense, defense is racing against one another. So in terms of the new technologies, and I'm going to talk about a few of them in the rest of the talk, what is it that we're seeing emerging? And of course, I am not predicting the future until 2090. And some, I guess, within Department of Defenses, but simply over the next 10 years here. A few things that are very important to monitor are next generation technologies for that would provide the ability of military to conduct military strikes with extreme accuracy and without relying on global navigation satellite systems. The reason why is multiple countries have developed GPS systems and they used it for military applications, in particular precision strikes. But if you're able to conduct those precision strikes without relying on space assets, then you could have a strategy where you would try to blind your adversaries or prevent them from using their space assets and be the only states essentially to be able to conduct precise warfare without the need to rely on such assets. So it's a kind of a holy grail, if you wish, and everyone is running towards developing that technology. Another big issue in the context of nuclear weapon is whether next generation of sensors and technology will be able to increase our ability to detect submarines. Submarines are currently believed to be the most survivable leg of nuclear forces, especially in the US, the UK, France. And new technology, whether they may or may not be able to change how anti-submarine warfare is conducted, is a very important topic to follow. Of course, we're also seeing now, and I will talk about it, new capabilities to conduct real-time day and night and all-weather tracking and monitoring of assets all over the world. And together in that bundle, also, but kind of separate because it's slightly different, software-based emerging technologies and hardware to some extent around cyber and artificial intelligence. And here, the risk of the development of those technologies, which are actually developed quite fast and fielded into a weapon system, as I'm speaking, is their ability to exploit and disrupt command and control structures and weapon systems to provide avenues to attack, to essentially exploit vulnerability way before a conflict even can start. And of course, the fielding of artificial intelligence everywhere, whether it's through the development of autonomous weapon system, also brings a lot of challenges. Now, with the promises of those emerging technologies, what we hear is that they will bring essentially another new revolution in military affairs. There are questions to their reason to doubt that this is the case in many areas. So I will be talking about whether the risks are essentially real, or if it's more kind of hot air, if you want, and buzzwords that are being thrown around. So the first area I want to focus on is the advances of sensing. And everything I will talk about, of course, is in the context of nuclear weapons and their safety, security, and survivability. So here, I want to highlight something as I begin. Is there was a conference last fall in 2020, organized and sponsored by the US Air Force, very interesting conference on accelerating the deployment and work done on quantum technologies, in particular quantum sensing. And here we had the former Assistant Secretary of the Air Force saying something that was extremely interesting, is that they had created this quantum technology accelerator conference as a way to bring new quantum phenomena in the military. And that it didn't care what those phenomena were. The point was just to start making what he called this new battleground of physics, something that is as common place as the airplane or satellite today. So we are saying, this rhetoric around great power competition and the role of technology now being brought into our academic conferences. Of course, there are interest for the military in developing those technologies. And as I mentioned, a big one here for the future is the next generation of positioning, navigation, and timing systems. So here, because GPS is essentially, we've been relying on those space assets to conduct military operations. The problem they have is like they're really weakly defended. They can be spoofed, jammed, taken down, perhaps with anti-satellite weapons. And so it is really an advantage if one can develop ways to conduct warfare in GPS-denied environment. And so here's an example where we see the developments of sensors. Here it's a quantum sensor, a nitrogen vacancy diamond quantum sensor to measure minute changes in the Earth magnetic fields that would help pinpoint weapon whereabouts, essentially to an accuracy of about 50 meters. So that is quite amazing to some extent, although 50 meters is definitely not enough to conduct pinpoint accuracy strikes. In this same realm of developing quantum technology, another one is atomic clocks. It's very interesting here is when you conduct military warfare, you want all your assets essentially to move and fire and deploy themselves in a way that is coordinated. And so timing is extremely important, but is often extremely centralized. And so if you want to not rely on possibly vulnerable assets that could be hacked or destroyed, you want to decentralize the ability of timing to all your different subsystems. And one way to do that is for the development of new atomic clocks that you can share essentially everywhere. moving forward beyond PNT, what we see as renewed interest for sensing is our ability to detect submarines. So as I said, submarines are believed to be the most robust and resilient leg of the triad, extremely hard to find when they're diving at pretty large depth in the ocean, kind of losing themselves for 70 days, extremely hard to track and so on. And so we're now seeing new projects that are trying to change the paradigm of anti-submarine warfare. But here again, we're seeing over-promising essentially. So one technology that we've seen popping up in the news is the use of quantum sensors that will somehow make the ocean transparent and allow China to detect US submarines everywhere, anywhere, at any time through new quantum gravimeters or through new quantum magnetometers. And here again, if one look at the numbers of what current gravimeters are capable to do, we see that the current capabilities are to detect submarines are extremely low in the ranges of 50 to 100 meters. So you essentially have to be close to the submarines that you're looking for to be able to find it, and that to make those technology actually useful, in particular for gravimeters, you're going to need to improve your capabilities by several orders of magnitudes, which I do not know if it's impossible, but it's going to be extremely challenging, at least in the near future. Another technologies in terms of sensing that has been floating around and making important claims about revolutionary impact on warfare is quantum elimination and quantum radars. So here the idea is that you can end stealth. Essentially, you can detect targets that are extremely stealthy by leveraging the entanglement properties of photons that are highly correlated. The way this radar works essentially is you create a pair of entangled photon and you shoot one of them towards the target and you keep the second one idle. And then when the first photon you send, if it bounces back on your target and comes back, you can find that photon in the thermal background by looking for high correlation between that photon and the one you keep idle. Now, the problem here is a lot of that, the subsystem part of the technology have not yet been developed. It's still a long way to go. And if you look at what you would require to actually make it useful, we're talking about billions of pairs of entangled photons that you would need to use to detect, let's say 2-meter objects 25 kilometers away in low visibility conditions. So radars that have extremely short range, so not necessarily very interesting if you want to see targets, incoming planes from far away. But nevertheless, I mean, those technology are here and they're being developed. Beyond sensors, and perhaps what is way more promising in terms of potential impact on what can be done is our ability to track things all over the world. And that really is, we're seeing extremely large improvement in our ability to practice essentially situational awareness. So using large satellite constellations that have no rapid revisit time, we're able to see movements of assets pretty much everywhere in the world. The way this constellation works today, you have many private companies that are launching 10, 20, 30, hundreds of satellites to provide industries with extremely high resolution imagery, let's say 30 centimeters today, at revisit time of the order of a few hours, with all kinds of different spectral sensor packages. So what does this mean in practice is that those companies in the industry are driving us essentially towards a state of an ability to perform constant monitoring all over the world. This is an image from an Argentinian company, that shows plans. So right now, obviously, starting from a small constellation of 16 satellites, so providing 2 hours revisit time. So essentially, you can image, pretty much every spot on the Earth every 2 hours. And increasing this with larger constellations to provide revisit time of a few minutes, and then you are able to do constant monitoring pretty much everywhere from space. And so I would expect that we'll see this technology moving forward. Of course, one key point here is, there are clouds everywhere. Clouds coverage is bad for optical imagery from satellites, and it's also night, on average half of the day. But we've seen, the fielding of new sensors that can alleviate those problems. And one of them is synthetic aperture radars that are now fielded on the same types of constellations. And here's an image in the background of the Ever Given tankers, container ships who was stuck in the Suez Canal a few weeks ago, using SAR imagery from a private company. And in the insert image, you see the Gulf of Suez with the bright spots being individual ships. And you see that as the crisis was unfolding, more and more ships were parked into the Gulf of Suez. So that technology works day and night and under cloud coverage. And that company, which is one of the several star constellation companies that is fielding assets, essentially this year should get to a capability of providing imaging pretty much everywhere on Earth with a revisit time of under an hour. So you will get SAR imaging at relatively high resolution everywhere on Earth every hour. So this is opening up a whole new ability to track nuclear weapon systems all over the world. Of course, land-based systems, but road mobile missiles, but also submarines. And of course, most of the time they're very deep underwater, and they're very hard to find. But that new capability and capacity is going to help us perhaps spot check them, as some of them leave ports, harbor, go on to training exercise, or actually deploy for the deterrence mission and so on. And so here is an image from open source analyst who spotted a Russian ballistic missile leaving its on port, and including an image of the visible wake of that submarine over 5 miles long, which is pretty amazing. Probably the sea was not so rough that day. But my point here is we're going to image the entire planet several, let's say 24, perhaps 100 times a day. Right now it's imaging mostly focused on land masses, but of course you are going to start to be able to image the oceans as well. And so we'll be able to track naval assets very well, very quickly. All of this sensor data and tracking ability is obviously going to be powered up by improvements in our information processing capabilities. And here really, we're hearing it everywhere, is the development of machine learning and deployment of machine learning algorithm, or AI technology that some of their proponents describe as transforming all aspects of military affairs. And so here I'm just quoting a report that was came out a few weeks ago from the so-called National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, a report that was extremely well received, you know, in DoD circles, and you know, with amazing claims that in the future warfare will pit algorithm against algorithm, that the source of battlefield advantage will shift from traditional factors like force size and levels of armaments to factors like superior data collection and assimilation, connectivity, computing power, algorithm, and system security. So the very key technologies that our leaders, you know, President Biden and other leaders around the world are seeing as key to, you know, military dominance in this century or over the next decades, are you know, being seen as extremely transformative in the way we conduct warfare, and without any doubt in some sense, which is amazing. Of course, you know, AI perhaps will bring this superior data collection, assimilation, and ability to analyze information, but it will bring, you know, it will bring new risk, and not necessarily going into what will be the consequences of developing machine learning algorithm everywhere in the military. Just looking at our own reliance today on information systems, and seeing the type and level of cyber attacks we're seeing today that don't leverage those new technology is amazing. And so here I just wanted to flag out the recent SolarWinds attack that was allegedly perpetrated by Russia on U.S. companies and government entities. And what you see here is you don't even need extremely sophisticated. I mean, you do need sophisticated system and state organization to perpetrate those attacks. But what you see is our ability to defend against them. We don't even require new algorithm or AI or whatsoever. But a lot of time it's pretty much about common sense for 80 to 90% of all the cyber attacks that are going on today. There was an interesting sub story here with SolarWinds, is that one of their password for updating the software, which was a way that was used by attacker to compromise that company, was SolarWinds 123. And so during their hearings, you had Representative Katie Porter who told them that she had stronger password essentially to stop kids from watching too much YouTube on their iPad. But so what I want to stress here is we're living in an environment where cyber attacks with or without AIs are already ongoing, and the situation is very likely just going to get worse. Now, what we've seen from state using cyber capabilities to attack other states is that the situation and our prediction for the future is essentially very dire, in the sense that we've already seen attacks to destroy physical assets. So one famous example was the Stuxnet attack, was used to disable Iranian centrifuges and was carried around in the late 2000, early 2010. We've seen pre-positions exploit against power plants. We've seen attacks against missile developments programs. So we have very sophisticated state structures and organization today that are exploiting, cyber vulnerability to conduct, essentially beyond sabotage, beyond operation that leads not just to retrieving information or eavesdropping or intelligence gathering, but really destroying physical systems. And in the realm of nuclear weapons, one of the key assets that you want to prevent from being destroyed is your ability to command and control your forces, whether it's to understand the situation where crisis is unfolding and you want to monitor the possibility of launches, missile launches towards your territory and so on, but also to be able to manage and keep control on your forces so that the situation doesn't escalate rapidly and go out of control. Now, we also, in the history of cyber attack or cyber exercise, over 25 years ago, we've already seen exercises, and this is one that was conducted by the NSA in 1997, of using cyber attacks against command and control structures with extremely high rate of success, essentially. And that is a precedent that is interesting because it shows that this is something that has been fought for about 25 years. And one would expect a number of states to at least think about how perhaps disable or overstates command and control structures for, in their way to conduct warfare or even possibly use nuclear weapon systems. And so in this exercise, there was something amazing is the communication were tapped also, and the NSA there was a red team disrupting the DoD command and control structure, and they could hear on the phone, there was one person on the phone was telling another one, I don't trust my command and control anymore. And so I just wanted to put that quote out here. I encourage you to watch this very nice video, kind of the summary of the exercise of the parts that have been declassified that are extremely interesting. So to wrap up that section here, we're in a situation that is, I think, problematic, where we have the alignment of the military, industry, and so on, and the alignment with the language around the return of great power competition that are telling us that technologies is going to be key to our future ability to conduct warfare. We're pouring a lot of money into systems, and we're starting seeing proposal for new weapon systems where essentially humans are taken out of the loop. And it's just not autonomous weapons, it's our ability to command and control and conduct warfare that is being put into question and will perhaps be revolutionized here. So to conclude, I want to say that yes, we are experiencing today rapid technological developments, driving, but also driven by strategic interest, that there are massive pressure from leaders, militaries, and industries to innovate in those fields. That the key here is for technology developments to provide a way or to be a strategy to overmatch adversaries. And so it's not something that we think about getting to a place where we try to avoid conflict or keep crisis situations stable. Now here is really using technologies to dominate others. And that creates, a circle of, I think, profound instabilities that I hope we won't have to see over the next 10, 20 years, but that is currently unfolding essentially without any breaks on them. Surprisingly, on the nuclear weapons side, modernization plans are moving forward, pretty much assuming that nothing will change for the next 50, 60, 70 years, which is to some extent astonishing. So what does this mean, all those technological evolution for nuclear weapons system? Well, we do see possible improvement in capabilities, but I think even more so in terms of vulnerabilities. And that we need to better understand that. What will be the impact of key technologies, especially on the safety, security, and the survivability of nuclear forces. And it is unclear to me whether those studies have been conducted, as we are accelerating plans for force modernization. In particular, military planners, typically assume the worst. And if we're living in this environment of over-promising technological revolution, that will drive more instability. That being said, the destructive capabilities or the total yield of current nuclear weapons remains the same. There are very little plans to, well, some plans perhaps in China to increase slightly the arsenal. Britain also made comments recently to increase the size of their arsenal, but by a few dozen nuclear weapons perhaps. But really what is the key here is the revolution in the support structure and tempo of warfare that is evolving rapidly, that we're being promised essentially will be taken over by software and algorithm. And we need to put perhaps some thought into this, whether that is a good idea or not. Moving forward, what can we do in our physics community, I think, is just like Fred Lamb was presenting on missile defense, is to provide public scientific reality checks essentially on technological developments that seem over-promising and destabilizing. And I have a few ideas I'd be happy to share with you in the next session. But not only that, it's, I think, also our responsibility to kind of resist the siren songs here and to not agree that physics become again a battleground. It shouldn't be a battleground. Physics should be about the pursuit of knowledge and to increase our I would say collective and knowledge for the greater good. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sebastien. This is a very daunting set of topics. We're kind of at just within 1 minute, the end of the whole session, and the questions hadn't yet started to come in. So I think maybe I'll ask one question, and then we can take the discussion to the other site. The question is, if maybe you want to answer this when we go to the discussion session. If submarines become vulnerable, I mean, obviously then the retaliation deterrent is compromised. But have you thought through what the effect would be on nuclear strategy? It's not obvious to me. It would be negative. I don't know.
Well, if you don't have an assured second strike capability, then in crisis situation, you may want to use your weapon first. If especially you don't have perfect information whether the deployed forces at the time of the crisis are protected or survivable. So I think the flip side is really to start re-increasing the number of deployed assets, and that is problematic. Will lead to new arms race and new instability here very quickly.
I think we have a question, but I think we're going to take these questions on the other side of the commercial break, as they say.
Okay.
I want to say to all the attendees who'd like to stick around for discussion, as you know, and I think on the lower left-hand side of the screen, it says join the networking session. Just push that and you'll be in the discussion session for this session. And for the speakers, you have a link and we'll hope for the best. If that doesn't work, you go to the page for this session and you can click on the link that the attendees are clicking on. So with that, I'd like to thank the three speakers for incredibly informative and provocative talks. And we'll see you in a minute. I'll close the session. Bye, everybody.